Would you open up your Bibles, please, to Proverbs chapter 30. God designed everyone for relationships. He wants us to have a close relationship with Him, and He wants us to have a close relationship with people. Those are good things. But sometimes we don't have a good relationship with God, not because of anything on His part, but more on our part. Then there are times you try to have a relationship with other people, and you know what it's like. You want to get close to some people, and they're more like a porcupine, or maybe they're like a grizzly bear. It's like it's a really difficult time to have with people. God does want us to have good relationships, and that'll be our focus for the next few months here as we go through the book of Proverbs. And one way to illustrate will be with marriage. So many of the illustrations will be with marriage, but it doesn't mean you have to be married to apply. These are principles that we can apply even as single adults to relate to other people, to coworkers, to neighbors, but even for senior adults, this is good to help be wiser to share with the younger generation. I'd like to mention that it may come as a shock to some of you, but some marriages actually have problems. And when the people are surveyed, they usually pick these top few reasons for what is really wrong with their marriage. Often at the very top is poor communication. And when I see that, I almost have to laugh or chuckle, because the people who fill out the forms are primarily women, and women are more verbal, and that's definitely a desire more for them. If it were designed by or filled out by men, we'd probably get a different answer, and then it would still be equally not very accurate. But let's move on to another area. I mean, what if a survey result said the biggest problem in my marriage is that my wife is not submissive? You would obviously say that's a bit biased, and it would be. Another topic would be a lack of intimacy. Who knows, maybe the guys mention that more. Sometimes people say there's too much boredom. With that, there's this sense of many saying the biggest problem in marriage is infidelity. The other person. And because of that, there's a lack of trust. And it just snowballs. The problems with jealousy involved. It didn't have to be a person. It could be the internet. It could be chat. It could be a bunch of different things that break up a marriage that way. Another general topic that's pictured as a problem with relationships and marriage is a lack of appreciation and that lack of gratitude for what is being done. We'll spend time on that in a later message, just like many of these will be addressed more. But another one is financial issues. That's the real reason we have marriage problems, some people say. But you know, we have yet to cover anything that's a real reason for marriage problems. None of these are, especially the next one. Some people say one of their real major marriage problems is their children. Okay, so they blame their problems on their kids. And then the chore wars, where one is supposed to take out the trash, the other one is supposed to prepare the meal, the other one is supposed to wash the dishes afterwards, one of them is supposed to get the money, one of them, well, it was my turn to take care of the kids last night when they cried in the middle of the night. It's your turn, and the chore wars of fighting back and forth. These are all symptoms. And when marriages try to resolve their family difficulties, their relationships by addressing these, they waste their time. They are a total waste of time. It would be like me gouging myself accidentally with a sharp object, and there's a big gash in my arm, and I go to the hospital, and they say, well, you need to put a bucket underneath there. And it won't stop. And they go, we need to get an even bigger bucket. That's not the problem. And addressing each one of these issues is addressing a symptom. It has nothing to do with the core. Well, before we look at the Bible, I want us to look at a few ways that people go to find out what is the truth. How can I have a better marriage? And believe it or not, one response is simply to avoid people. I've heard this many times. I wish I could move into a log cabin right in the middle of Alaska, 100 miles away from everyone. I'm so tired of conflicts. But there's a problem there. God made us to have relationships. That's why you hear some men say about women, you can't live without them, you can't live with them. And then you hear some women say about the men, you can't live without them and you can't live with them. What's going on? Because God designed us to have a relationship. And when conflicts come up, it's easy for us to say, I don't want to deal with it, I want to run. So you run away, but you have a desire to have a close relationship. But you can't. There's that tug of war. So avoiding does not solve the problem. Another solution people give is just give in to the other person. You know, the mindset of the abused kids. The only way to win is to lose. Because the more you fight, the more pain comes. So to minimize pain, just give in to what they say. Women will follow up by saying, so you're saying I must be a doormat. A man says I must just give up all my leadership and hero aspects and just do whatever the family wants. That's not the solution either. And then unfortunately the biggest way is people listen to the world. Whatever the world says. Now, when I grew up, just by observation only, society as a whole started to brainwash me into thinking that the person with the greatest wisdom and knowledge about relationships is Abigail Van Buren. And Ann Landers as well. Because every week it's in the paper, Dear Abby, I have all these problems. Would you please help me with all my relationship problems? You know, back in those days, people respected the older generation. Now there's no more Dear Abby, but there's Dear Annie, and a very, very young-looking woman who has all the answers to life. I never read those articles, but with this topic coming up, I've pulled out a few. And is relationship doomed after she cheated? Next one. Best to keep your relationship problems private. And she has all the answers for you. And then they let you know at the end that she has written a book. It'll probably be a bestseller. And the title of it is, if I can, well, I guess I lost it. But the idea is how to respond when your partner cheats. That's the book. And the whole title is so messed up because it's no longer spouse, it's partner. And when I was looking at the internet a little bit, just some general ideas about the subject matter, I could not find one website that said spouse. It's completely replaced with martyr. Because if you believe in the spouse, you're one of those old-fashioned people who believe in the Bible that a couple should get married, start with vows, and then have relationships afterwards. But today it's do whatever, whenever, with whomever, however, animal, kid, old person, dying person in the hospital. It's like do whatever. And here's the rest of the picture. When you have that relationship, you need to demand that the other person does everything for you. But you don't have to have any commitment yourself. How in the world can a partner cheat when they've never given vows for a marriage? That's the craziest thing I have heard over and over. People who visit our churches, none of you, but people who visit, they say, I'm so angry my partner cheats. I say, how can they cheat? They've never vowed. I mean, the world's perception is so messed up. Even the concept of adult content. You know what the phrase means? It means, yeah, what the Bible says is wrong for kids, but for us adults, we can do whatever we want to. Why is it illegal, immoral for kids, but parents and adults can do whatever they want to because there's something magical about turning 18 or 21? Society keeps enforcing this. Do you know you get tax breaks for living in fornication as opposed to being married? Society promotes all of this, and if you live by the world, your life is headed for problems. But let's bypass all that and let's move to what the Bible says in Proverbs 30. It's not our primary passage for today, but it gives us a good jump start into the problems of the world. Look at Proverbs 30, beginning with verse 18. Here we have a picture of the ideal that God is looking for. There are 3 things which are too wonderful for me, 4 which I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the middle of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. This is God's design. For a couple to come together after marriage, He wants it to be enjoyable, hilarious, fun, exciting, exhilarating in marriage. It's supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be exciting. But the world says, no, we need to step over the boundary and take that with us. And that's when problems oftentimes start. Look back at verse 17, and let's look at one of the ways that a couple really begins with problems. One of many ways. Verse 17 says, the eye that mocks a father and scorns a mother, the ravens of the valley will pick it out, and the young eagles will eat it. As we will see later in this message and for the next several weeks, we need to see life from God's perspective, not from our own. And one of the ways people have problems is because young people have shaken their fist at their parents and say, I don't want to listen to what you have to say. I'm smarter and wiser than you, and I'm going to do whatever I want to do. God promises the eye that mocks the father and the one that scorns the mother, that one will be punished. I know that person's not a Christian, but I'm doing missionary dating. And then they go ahead and marry, and a year later, they finally see the problems that take place. And how do they solve it? They blame the church. And then they go to the church and demand that we solve the problem somehow. That's human nature. So one of the problems for marriage sometimes is we disobeyed God by disobeying our parents and doing what we want to do. Look at another aspect in verses 21 to 23. He says, there are 3 things in the earth that causes the earth to quake. Under 4 it cannot bear up. In verse 22, we have 2 different images of a man, and in verse 23, 2 images for a woman. So we'll go back to verse 22. Under a slave when he becomes king, and a fool when he is satisfied with food. The idea is he wants to be in control. He wants to demand that everybody else do what he says. And what did verse 21 say? Who can live under that? When a man demands to be selfish and tyrannical and control everybody else. Now, God made us men to be in charge, to be leaders, to be heroes. But when that's distorted and it's selfish, it controls the family. Look at verse 23. When an unloved woman gets a husband, the only way to be satisfied is to have a relationship with God. But if she doesn't find that relationship with God and she starts chasing after men, she becomes a nonstop vacuum cleaner towards men. Love me, and no matter what he does, it's never enough. Who can live under that? Constant, you need to love me more. We see the problems that come here, but let's go to the solution. Let's go back to the very first verse of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 1. Let's now look at ways that we can actually apply principles in our lives that go to the real root of issues and then start having better relationships. Proverbs 1:1 says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel." Solomon was the wisest man because God placed on him more wisdom than anybody else. Sadly, he still had free will and he chose to do evil often. But still in the book of Proverbs, we have amazing principles to go to, which you hardly ever read from Dear Abby or Dear Ann Landers or Dear Annie today. Look at verse 2. If you read the book of Proverbs, this is what happens. To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding. Now push that to the full extreme. If you don't read the Bible and read Proverbs, you won't have wisdom. And you will have relationship problems. Verse 3, by doing this, you will receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. I know equity means a little bit different from what I'm about to say, but it still fits. I will do my absolute best in these next several months. For every illustration I give for a woman, I will try to give an illustration for a man. If I say there's something that men do that's not so good, I'll try to come back with something a woman does that's not so good. Because there's neither a man who's better than a woman or a woman better than a man. We're different. And for every complaint about a man, there's a complaint against a woman. For every complaint against a woman, there's a complaint against a man. I will try to be balanced. It's not one-sided at all, that it's just one person's problem. So there's equity, truthfulness, justice, fairness when we read Proverbs. Verse 4, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth, knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. So the Proverbs were given to us to understand life. And now we come to the first major point of the message, which is in verse 7. The first major point is that a great life begins with fearing God and knowing His ways. You will not see that in most all books on marriage written by Christians. The focus is on better communication. You need to love each other. You need to be kinder to each other. And that's totally off track. The book says the beginning. Look at verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And people say, but you don't understand. Our kids are smart today. They know how to use cell phones. They know how to use computers. Some of them don't know how to put on their pants or tie their shoes, but they know how to use a cell phone. And our schools are so off track today, I'm speaking generally, because they don't need to know what God says, yet God states point blank, how do you begin to know knowledge? It's the fear of the Lord. Oh, anybody can memorize trivia and win the Jeopardy game, but who knows how to live life and relate to other people and have love and joy and peace? That's a different story. And it begins with the fear of the Lord. To say that His ways are right. And the next time I have a problem, I'm not going to write long distance to Dear Abby or to Dear so-and-so and hope that I read that article in 5 months from now and finally get the answer. And then the answers they give are so not biblical. That was a very nice way for me to reply. It's not biblical and the answers are bizarre. Let's go to the second major part of the message, which you'll need to jump over to chapter 3 of Proverbs. We'll cover more of chapter 1 and chapter 2 in the next couple of weeks. But the second point of the message is that obeying God leads to great relationships. Look at verse 1. It says, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments." Do you hear what that's saying? Forget not the teaching. That means memorize them. The second half of verse 1, we need to do them. And when we do that, the rest of the chapter lists multiple benefits. Look at verse 4. "So you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and men." How do you have a good relationship? You start off with the fear of the Lord, and then you study His ways. What does He say we should do with our lives? That is the foundation for everything in the next several weeks, and it'll be the biggest tug of war in every heart that's in this room. Because it's easy to do some of these suggestions people give, but for us to humble ourselves and do things God's way, that'll be different. Let me now list two things I wish I had put into the bulletin insert. At the start, I mentioned all kinds of crazy things that people say are the real reasons for marital problems. Let me give you the only two. There are only two. And if these are never addressed, there will never be financial, that too. There won't be any marital harmony. There won't be peace in relationships. The real problem in marriage, number one, is selfishness. And we all agree, yep, it's selfishness. It doesn't matter how much you communicate, but you need to tell me you love me. Okay, I love you. That didn't solve anything. Selfishness is deep and requires so much more than just a few words to change. And number two, we've seen in this passage that we need to fear the Lord, humble ourselves before Him, so not to do it is selfishness. And He also said if you read these Proverbs, you'll have wisdom and understanding. So the number two problem is ignorance. And I mean that in a positive way. They just don't know. A couple gets together, they're newlyweds. One of them is smacking his lips. He keeps his mouth open when he eats. And she says, "Honey, do you know that bothers me? Would you please stop?" And he goes, "Why, I do love you. And I did not know that bothered you. Why, I'll stop." Why did he do it before? He didn't know. It was ignorance. He just didn't know. So either people do know, and they're rebellious against God. I'm not going to follow your ways. I want what I want. Or number two, they really don't know. Sometimes people just need to be told. So those are the real two issues. It's not lack of communication. It's none of the others that were mentioned earlier. Let's move on to the third major part. I said earlier that if we follow God's ways, there will be many benefits. So the third part of the message is obeying God leads to additional benefits. Look again at verse 1. "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you." Is that just a nice statement, or is it true? That if we will fear God, understand what He says, memorize, and actually do what He says, God says you will have peace. It's true. Because one of the principles about life that's totally opposite with the world says, if other people would only stop doing what they do to me, my life would be better. Put a couple together in marriage counseling. He asks her, "What's the problem with the marriage?" It's him. He asks him, "What's the problem with the marriage?" It's her. The truth is, nobody can make you angry. That is wonderful. Nobody can get you upset. If you become upset and angry, it's your choice. That is a wonderful truth, to know that God gives us the power to have peace even in the midst of turmoil. We can still be relaxed and have peace. But what does Satan say? No, it's everybody else's problem. Adam says, but God, it's the woman you gave me. So God goes to Eve and, no, it's the serpent's fault. He made me do it. But the truth is, you could have the meanest boss in the world, the meanest neighbor, and still have peace. Now think about what would be true if that were not true. If other people can make you angry, you become their little voodoo doll. That every time they want you to cry, they take up a pen and they poke it and you start whining and crying. But it doesn't work that way. They can't control you. So when that revelation comes, it adds to peace and joy. I can be peaceful in the relationship, even if the other person isn't. Even if my boss is still angry at me. Even if my brothers and sisters still fight. Even if my coworkers fight. And in those few churches, even if church members begin to fight, I can still be at peace because I trust in the Lord, I memorize His truths, and I keep them. We will see this over and over throughout this time period. Take the area of gratefulness, that one topic alone. Do you know that one says, I will be ungrateful if I set these expectations. And if you live up to here, why should I tell you thanks when you haven't done all these? And even if you live up to all my expectations, why should I even say thank you? Because of what you're supposed to do. But when you get rid of your expectations and your spouse actually comes back home, you rejoice because you didn't expect anything. Get rid of your expectations and your joy skyrockets. Simple truths in the Bible that really do bring joy, peace. Look at verse 3. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. No one can take it from you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Skip down to verse 7. Do not be wise in your own eyes. And all of us human beings do that. Oh, God's ways just don't make much sense. That's just cultural for those days. Why, things are different today. God says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Verse 8, it will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Did you know the number one cause for physical problems, for bad health, the number one cause for illnesses is bad relationships with God and with others? Just two of those topics, guilt and bitterness. Guilt, there's a difference between you and God now, and He's convicting you. Bitterness towards other people, those two alone make up, if I take the average of what I hear from doctors, between 50 and 90% of all illnesses come from just those two things. The problem is not the illness. The problem is our relationship with God and our relationship with people. And when we do what's right, our health comes back to us. It's wonderful. Verse 9, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. If you receive anything, it's because God has given it to you. The moment you say it's yours and you hold on to it, you don't understand wealth. And your insides get all messed up, and that relationship with God changes. There's so many different things we'll talk about with finances. But when you understand God has given you all of your money, when He tells you to pass it on, it's not yours, it's His. And there's joy in giving. But when we hold on to it, it tears us apart. The next verse, verse 10 says, so your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. He is not saying you will become a millionaire. He's saying he will give you more than you need. It might be $1. It might be an ice cream cone. It might be an extra car. I don't know how he distributes that. But the point is, he'll meet your needs. Finances are never a problem for marriages. Finances are always a symptom of our relationship with God and others. So we can't blame a bad relationship on a symptom. For example, the Bible speaks clearly in Proverbs, do not co-sign for another person. But people do that, and why do people co-sign? It says, well, if I can't pay it, someone else will. And then the other person ends up paying for it, and then there's tension between this person, or when are you going to give me back my money? And this person thinks every time this other one calls him up, it's obvious he wants money, and the tensions build. Why? Because of not obeying God's ways. Financial problems. God promises he'll meet all of our needs if we obey him first. It doesn't go the other way around that if we have financial problems, that's what's causing our marriage to fall apart. It doesn't go backwards. The very beginning is the hardest part, the biggest challenge for all of us, including me. Some of you automatically gravitate to obeying God in some areas, but there are other areas that are more challenging. The same for all of us. And when we come to that point, are we going to obey God even though we don't understand? Or are we going to do what we want to do? When you choose to do what's right, it might cause some people to have some animosity towards you, but in the end, many of them will say to you, you are right all along. My admiration for you is through the roof. I appreciate you standing for what is right. So everything gets summed up in our final passage. Would you now look at chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Here's the heart, if we could say that. It will be the heart because I'm choosing it to be that for the next several weeks. How do we improve relationships? Chapter 3, verse 5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Selfish hearts say, but you don't understand, my spouse does this and my spouse does that. And God says, don't worry about it, I'm working on that person. Let's just work on you. But God, what about that other person? God says, just trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Step one, the biggest step of all to having a good relationship with people, is fearing the Lord, obeying him, trusting in him. And that's when life becomes wonderful. We see people from a brand new perspective that just clears us up. Great peace and love and joy come into our hearts. Will you choose that today? So would you bow your heads in prayer?